Every morning,
Here you go,
long
dear.
before the
Fresh and
sun
hot.
peeked over the
Oh, bless
horizon,
you. Thank
the
you
maid
so
would wake
much.
up in
You're
her
very
small,
welcome.
modest home. The walls were plain, and the furniture was simple, but it was a space she cherished. She had no alarm clock, yet her body seemed to know the exact time. It was as if her dedication to her work had trained her like clockwork. She quietly stepped out of bed, careful not to wake the children of the family she worked for, or the neighbors who might still be sleeping. Her mornings were never rushed, though they were packed with routine, because she believed that starting the day calmly would help her do her work better and with more care. She began with small tasks that many people might overlook. First, she cleaned the kitchen, wiping the counters until they gleamed. She organized the pots and pans, arranged the cutlery, and made sure every surface was spotless. To her, these details mattered because they reflected the respect she had for the people she served. Even though she could not afford luxuries herself, she found joy in creating order and beauty in someone else's home. Then came the breakfast preparations. She carefully measured each ingredient, ensuring nothing was wasted, and cooked with patience, knowing that every meal carried more than just food, it carried love, care, and her own sense of responsibility. While cooking, she hummed soft tunes to herself, a habit she had picked up to keep the quiet mornings lively. The smells of freshly cooked bread, sweet tea, and lightly fried eggs filled her home and seemed to energize her for the day ahead. Though she had little, she gave her all in each breakfast she prepared, believing that no act of kindness was too small. She knew the elderly woman she served had no family to cook for her, no children to remind her to eat breakfast on time, and so her role, though humble, carried great importance. Once the breakfast was ready, she carefully packed everything in neat containers, making sure the food remained warm and presentable. She double-checked to ensure nothing was missing: spoons, napkins, even a small note of greeting or encouragement when she could manage it. To her, the little touches mattered. They were small sparks of human connection that often went unnoticed but made a big difference in someone's lonely morning. She walked out of her home carrying the warm containers, her steps light yet purposeful, feeling a sense of pride that came from knowing she was helping someone start their day with comfort and care. Her walk to the elderly woman's house was more than just a commute, it was a quiet time of reflection. She observed the neighborhood waking up, shopkeepers opening their stores, children running to school, and birds chirping in the trees. Each morning offered a new rhythm of life, and she loved being a small part of it. When she reached the old woman's gate, she knocked gently, waited for a greeting, and then entered with a smile that had become a routine yet heartfelt gesture. Over time, the elderly woman had come to rely on these visits. She often said little, but her eyes spoke volumes, filled with gratitude and warmth. Even on days when the maid felt tired or unwell, she pushed herself to maintain the routine. She understood that consistency mattered more than anything. To her, breakfast was not just a meal, it was a promise, a daily act that symbolized care, attention, and respect. And through this simple act, she found her own sense of purpose. While others might have considered her work menial, she saw it as sacred. Every plate she carried, every cup of tea she poured, was a small contribution to someone else's happiness. This routine was more than just a job. It was a reflection of her character, her patience, her empathy, and her unwavering dedication. She believed that life's true value was not measured by wealth or fame but by how much kindness one could share, even in the smallest gestures. Little did she know that these quiet, consistent mornings were slowly building a story of compassion that would reach far beyond her neighborhood, eventually catching the attention of someone who could change her life forever. By the time she finished her routine, cleaned the dishes, and waved goodbye to the elderly woman, the maid would return home with a quiet satisfaction. Her mornings were long, sometimes exhausting, but they were filled with purpose. In her heart, she knew that the world could be harsh, but small acts of goodness, like delivering breakfast every morning, could create warmth and hope that lasted far longer than a single day. Every day, the maid's routine extended far beyond simply delivering breakfast. While many would have considered her task finished once the food was placed at the elderly woman's doorstep, she treated each visit as an opportunity to bring light and comfort into someone else's life. She carried not just meals, but warmth, attention, and a quiet sense of companionship that could not be measured in money or rewards. She would arrive early in the morning, sometimes before the sun fully rose, carrying baskets filled with neatly prepared breakfast items. But before handing anything over, she would pause to look around the old woman's home. Was there dust on the shelves? Were the windows streaked from the morning dew? Even small, unnoticed details mattered to her. She would take a soft cloth from her bag and wipe surfaces that the elderly woman could no longer reach, making the space feel cleaner and brighter. To the maid, these were not chores, they were acts of love. Every sweep of her hand, every careful placement of a plate, was her way of saying, "I see you, and I care." Sometimes, she would help with the laundry or water the plants in the garden. She had a gentle touch, and the old woman often marveled at how even the smallest gestures could make such a difference. A pot of flowers that had been drooping suddenly seemed revived under the maid's careful attention. The old woman's house, once quiet and a little lonely, seemed to come alive during these morning visits, filled with the soft sounds of care, movement, and conversation. The maid never asked for thanks or recognition. Occasionally, the elderly woman would offer a small compliment, a smile, or a word of appreciation, and the maid would simply nod, her expression calm but satisfied. She understood that her reward was not in words but in the quiet moments when she saw the woman eat peacefully, sip her tea, or rest comfortably in her chair. Those moments were enough to give her a sense of purpose, to remind her that even small acts of kindness could have a profound impact on someone's day. What made her visits extraordinary was the way she personalized them. She remembered the old woman's favorite dishes, the way she liked her eggs cooked, the exact temperature of her tea. Some mornings, if the woman seemed sad or tired, the maid would sit beside her, listen to her stories, or share a soft laugh. She knew that meals were more than food, they were an opportunity to share company, to bring a sense of normalcy and human connection into a life that often felt quiet and lonely. Her kindness also extended to details others might overlook. She would fold napkins neatly, add a small piece of fruit or a sweet treat, and sometimes write little notes with simple messages like, "Have a good day," or "Take care of yourself." These tiny gestures, invisible to most, carried enormous weight in the elderly woman's life. They were reminders that someone cared enough to think beyond the routine, to infuse daily life with attention and affection. Even when the weather was harsh, scorching sun, pouring rain, or biting cold, the maid continued her visits without complaint. She understood that her consistency mattered more than convenience. To her, every day was an opportunity to be reliable, to offer stability and comfort in a world that could be unpredictable. The elderly woman came to depend on this rhythm, and their quiet companionship became an unspoken bond built over repeated, loving gestures. What the maid did each day was not extraordinary in the traditional sense. She had no titles, no fame, but the consistency of her kindness made her extraordinary. She showed that true compassion is found not in grand gestures but in the small, thoughtful acts that brighten another person's day. In a world that often overlooked the quiet and the humble, she was a shining example of how one person's care could ripple out in ways others might never notice. By the time she left, the house was not just clean and the breakfast set on the table, it felt alive with warmth. The elderly woman would sit back in her chair, a small smile on her face, feeling less alone, less tired, and more seen than she had felt in years. And the maid, walking back home through the early morning streets, felt a quiet satisfaction in her heart. She knew that the impact of her daily acts of kindness extended far beyond the breakfast she delivered. It touched the soul, brought comfort, and reminded her that every effort to care for someone mattered. Every day, the maid's routine extended far beyond simply delivering breakfast. While many would have considered her task finished once the food was placed at the elderly woman's doorstep, she treated each visit as an opportunity to bring light and comfort into someone else's life. She carried not just meals, but warmth, attention, and a quiet sense of companionship that could not be measured in money or rewards. She would arrive early in the morning, sometimes before the sun fully rose, carrying baskets filled with neatly prepared breakfast items. But before handing anything over, she would pause to look around the old woman's home. Was there dust on the shelves? Were the windows streaked from the morning dew? Even small, unnoticed details mattered to her. She would take a soft cloth from her bag and wipe surfaces that the elderly woman could no longer reach, making the space feel cleaner and brighter. To the maid, these were not chores, they were acts of love. Every sweep of her hand, every careful placement of a plate, was her way of saying, "I see you, and I care." Sometimes, she would help with the laundry or water the plants in the garden. She had a gentle touch, and the old woman often marveled at how even the smallest gestures could make such a difference. A pot of flowers that had been drooping suddenly seemed revived under the maid's careful attention. The old woman's house, once quiet and a little lonely, seemed to come alive during these morning visits, filled with the soft sounds of care, movement, and conversation. The maid never asked for thanks or recognition. Occasionally, the elderly woman would offer a small compliment, a smile, or a word of appreciation, and the maid would simply nod, her expression calm but satisfied. She understood that her reward was not in words but in the quiet moments when she saw the woman eat peacefully, sip her tea, or rest comfortably in her chair. Those moments were enough to give her a sense of purpose, to remind her that even small acts of kindness could have a profound impact on someone's day. What made her visits extraordinary was the way she personalized them. She remembered the old woman's favorite dishes, the way she liked her eggs cooked, the exact temperature of her tea. Some mornings, if the woman seemed sad or tired, the maid would sit beside her, listen to her stories, or share a soft laugh. She knew that meals were more than food, they were an opportunity to share company, to bring a sense of normalcy and human connection into a life that often felt quiet and lonely. Her kindness also extended to details others might overlook. She would fold napkins neatly, add a small piece of fruit or a sweet treat, and sometimes write little notes with simple messages like, "Have a good day," or "Take care of yourself." These tiny gestures, invisible to most, carried enormous weight in the elderly woman's life. They were reminders that someone cared enough to think beyond the routine, to infuse daily life with attention and affection. Even when the weather was harsh, scorching sun, pouring rain, or biting cold, the maid continued her visits without complaint. She understood that her consistency mattered more than convenience. To her, every day was an opportunity to be reliable, to offer stability and comfort in a world that could be unpredictable. The elderly woman came to depend on this rhythm, and their quiet companionship became an unspoken bond built over repeated, loving gestures. What the maid did each day was not extraordinary in the traditional sense. She had no titles, no fame, but the consistency of her kindness made her extraordinary. She showed that true compassion is found not in grand gestures but in the small, thoughtful acts that brighten another person's day. In a world that often overlooked the quiet and the humble, she was a shining example of how one person's care could ripple out in ways others might never notice. By the time she left, the house was not just clean and the breakfast set on the table, it felt alive with warmth. The elderly woman would sit back in her chair, a small smile on her face, feeling less alone, less tired, and more seen than she had felt in years. And the maid, walking back home through the early morning streets, felt a quiet satisfaction in her heart. She knew that the impact of her daily acts of kindness extended far beyond the breakfast she delivered. It touched the soul, brought comfort, and reminded her that every effort to care for someone mattered. Over time, the maid's quiet dedication began to catch the attention of the neighborhood. At first, no one paid much notice. After all, she was just another person going about her daily work. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, neighbors began to observe something remarkable. Rain or shine, scorching heat or biting cold, she never missed a day delivering breakfast to the elderly woman. Her movements were deliberate, calm, and filled with care, and there was a consistency to her routine that spoke volumes about her character. Some of the local shopkeepers started to whisper among themselves, admiring her devotion. "Look at her," one would say, nodding as she walked past with baskets of food balanced carefully in her arms. "She's been doing that every day for months, hasn't she?" They noticed the way she paused to tidy up the elderly woman's doorstep, how she straightened the small garden path, or adjusted the old woman's chair to make her more comfortable. These weren't chores most people would even think about, but the maid treated them as essential parts of her responsibility, as though caring for someone else's happiness was the most important work in the world. Children who played nearby would often follow her at a distance, curious about the bright smiles and gentle words she exchanged. Some began imitating her kindness in their own small ways, offering to help an elderly neighbor, picking up litter, or sharing snacks with someone who had none. Even though the maid never spoke about recognition or reward, her actions were silently teaching a lesson about empathy, patience, and generosity. The neighborhood quietly respected her, even if most never spoke to her directly about it. People started leaving small gifts at the elderly woman's doorstep, a fresh loaf of bread, a jar of jam, a warm scarf. They knew she would notice, knew she would appreciate these simple acts of community support, but more importantly, they realized her work had inspired them. The maid had become a symbol of goodness in a world that often seemed indifferent. Yet, despite this quiet recognition, she never changed. She did not allow pride or attention to alter her behavior. Even when a neighbor offered to help carry her baskets, she politely declined. "I can manage," she would say, smiling softly. Her humility was part of what made her so extraordinary. She cared, not for praise or gratitude, but because it was the right thing to do. And that unwavering sincerity was what began to turn heads in the community. The elderly woman's house became a subtle hub of inspiration. People passing by noticed how lively the garden looked after the maid's visits, how the windows sparkled, and how the air seemed warmer somehow. Some neighbors even remarked that the elderly woman's demeanor had changed. She was calmer, more cheerful, and more willing to interact with others. The maid's kindness didn't just impact the elderly woman, it radiated outward, touching the neighborhood in ways no one could fully explain. Interestingly, even strangers began to notice. Delivery men, mail carriers, and occasional visitors would pause to observe the ritual, impressed by the maid's dedication. Many assumed she was being paid handsomely for her time, but in truth, she worked for a modest salary. The effort she put in went far beyond financial compensation. It was her heart, her devotion, and her quiet insistence on doing good that set her apart. This attention from the community slowly built a reputation, though it was more about admiration than gossip. People spoke in hushed tones about her kindness, using her as an example when teaching children about compassion and responsibility. The maid, meanwhile, continued her routine, completely unaware of how much her consistency had moved others. She believed her actions were small, ordinary, even invisible, but the truth was far from it. Each day she delivered breakfast, wiped a counter, or helped the elderly woman sit comfortably, she was shaping the moral compass of the neighborhood without ever intending to. It was this quiet, uncelebrated, yet profoundly impactful pattern that eventually laid the groundwork for the story's turning point. The community may have been watching, but little did anyone know, someone far beyond the neighborhood was also paying attention. The maid's consistent acts of kindness, unnoticed by the world at large but visible to those who truly cared, were building toward an unexpected, life-changing encounter that would soon alter her life forever. One ordinary morning, the maid followed her usual routine. The sun had barely begun to rise, casting a soft golden glow across the quiet streets. The air was fresh, the neighborhood still sleepy, and she carried her baskets of breakfast with the same careful precision she had every day. But something felt different that morning, though she couldn't quite place it. The birds were unusually silent, and a subtle tension seemed to hang in the air, as if the universe itself was preparing for something extraordinary. As she approached the elderly woman's house, she noticed a sleek black car parked across the street. At first, she thought it belonged to a neighbor or a visiting guest. But as she drew closer, she saw a man step out of the vehicle, a tall, impeccably dressed figure with an air of quiet authority. His presence was striking, almost impossible to ignore. For a moment, the maid hesitated, unsure if she should continue her routine as normal. But her sense of duty propelled her forward. She carried the breakfast baskets up the familiar path, her heart beating slightly faster than usual. The elderly woman, sitting in her usual chair by the window, looked just as surprised as the maid. She squinted at the man, curiosity and caution flickering across her face. The stranger smiled warmly and tipped his head politely, then spoke in a calm, deliberate voice. "Good morning," he said, his tone carrying both respect and familiarity, though they had never met before. "I hope I'm not intruding." The maid froze for a moment. Something about him felt different, not threatening, not ordinary, but extraordinary in a way she could not explain. There was an unmistakable aura of power and refinement around him, yet his eyes held a softness that immediately set her at ease. She placed the breakfast baskets down carefully, her hands trembling ever so slightly, unsure of what to say. The man introduced himself as someone who had been watching quietly from afar. He explained that he was aware of her daily visits, her unwavering commitment to the elderly woman, and the countless small acts of kindness she performed without any expectation of reward. He called her devotion rare, even extraordinary, and expressed that it had touched him deeply. The maid blinked in disbelief. Who was this man, and why would someone so distinguished take notice of her humble work? He paused, allowing the weight of his words to sink in. "I have seen what many overlook," he said softly. "The way you care, the way you show respect and love in even the smallest details, it is remarkable. You make the world better without ever asking for recognition. That is why I am here today." The maid's mind raced. She had lived a life of quiet service, never expecting anything in return. She had never imagined that anyone beyond the neighborhood, beyond the elderly woman she served, could notice or care. And yet here was a man, someone who clearly wielded power and influence, acknowledging the true value of her actions. For a moment, the three of them stood in silence, the elderly woman watching with a mixture of astonishment and joy, the maid trying to process the surreal reality of the situation, and the man radiating calm assurance. Then he reached into his briefcase and produced a small envelope, simple yet elegant, placing it gently on the table. "Consider this a token of appreciation," he said. "But more importantly, consider this a reminder that goodness, no matter how quiet or small, never goes unnoticed." The maid's hands shook as she accepted it. Her mind could barely comprehend the implications. It was not just the material gesture, it was the validation of years of tireless, selfless work. It was proof that kindness, even when unseen, creates ripples that can reach far beyond one's immediate world. As she looked at the man, she realized that her routine, the quiet, consistent acts of care she had performed every single day, had built a story, one that had finally found an audience capable of changing her life. She felt a mix of awe, gratitude, and humility. Her heart swelled with a deep sense of purpose. She understood that her daily choices, her commitment to doing good without expectation, had led to this extraordinary encounter. The man smiled once more, nodded politely, and left, returning to his sleek car. The elderly woman turned to the maid, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "You see," she whispered. "Your kindness does matter. Someone noticed. Someone cared." The maid stood there for a long moment, holding the envelope, feeling the weight of the twist that had suddenly entered her life. She realized that while she had always believed that her work was small, ordinary, and perhaps even invisible, the universe had a way of rewarding the truly selfless in ways that were unimaginable. That morning, a new chapter of her life began, one that would forever remind her that genuine compassion and unwavering dedication have the power to attract miracles, even from the most unexpected corners of the world. The next morning, the maid woke with a strange mixture of anticipation and disbelief. Her daily routine, the one she had followed for years without question, suddenly felt heavier, yet more meaningful. The events of the previous day lingered in her mind, the sleek black car, the mysterious man's calm yet commanding presence, and his unexpected praise. She couldn't quite believe it had happened. Could it really be true? Was it possible that someone so powerful had noticed her quiet devotion? She shook her head, trying to steady her thoughts, and went about her preparations as usual, careful to keep a sense of normalcy. By the time she reached the elderly woman's house, her heart was pounding. The air felt different that morning, as if it carried a sense of destiny. The garden glistened with dew, the flowers seemingly brighter, and even the old wooden gate looked welcoming. As she approached, the man from the previous day stepped out of the car again, but this time, he was not alone. There was an air of formality about him, yet he smiled warmly, making the maid feel both important and comfortable. "Good morning," he greeted, his voice calm but imbued with genuine admiration. "I hope I'm not interrupting your work, but I wanted to visit today and speak with you directly." The maid's hands shook slightly as she placed the breakfast baskets down. This wasn't just a continuation of her routine anymore, it felt like a pivotal moment in her life. She had spent years performing acts of kindness quietly, never expecting anything in return, and now the universe seemed to be responding in ways she had never imagined. The billionaire motioned for her to sit, and as she did, he spoke about the power of small, consistent acts of goodness. He told her that in all his years of success, wealth, and influence, he had rarely witnessed such dedication, humility, and compassion. "Most people do good when they want recognition," he said, his eyes serious but kind. "But you do good because it's who you are. That is what makes you extraordinary." The elderly woman watched silently from her chair, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and pride. She had known all along the value of the maid's presence, but seeing someone else recognize it on such a grand scale left her speechless. The maid, meanwhile, felt a lump in her throat. She had never thought of herself as extraordinary. To her, she was simply doing what she believed was right. Then came the moment that truly changed everything. The billionaire reached into his briefcase and handed her a folder. Inside were documents offering her not just financial support, but opportunities she had never dreamed possible, a chance for education, a home of her own, and even a role in a foundation he personally oversaw that helped people in need. "This is not just about money," he said. "It's about recognizing and empowering people like you, who make a difference quietly, yet profoundly." Tears welled up in her eyes as she accepted the folder. For years, she had lived modestly, working tirelessly, and giving her best without expectation. And now, in a single moment, her life could change forever, not because she demanded it, but because she lived with integrity and a generous heart. The reality of it was almost too much to grasp. As they spoke, the billionaire asked about her life, her dreams, and her aspirations. He listened carefully, genuinely interested, and offered guidance and encouragement. There was no arrogance, no sense of superiority, only genuine respect. In his presence, the maid felt seen, valued, and understood in a way she had never experienced before. Before leaving, he shook her hand firmly and smiled. "Remember," he said, "what you do every day matters more than you realize. The world may not always notice immediately, but kindness has a way of reaching the right eyes at the right time." After he departed, the maid sat quietly, her mind racing. The envelope and folder in her hands represented more than material wealth, they symbolized validation, hope, and the promise of a better future. Yet, even amidst the surprise and excitement, she realized something profound. What had made her extraordinary wasn't the recognition or reward, but her unwavering commitment to doing good. Her life had been meaningful long before the billionaire arrived, he had merely reflected it back to her. The elderly woman reached out, placing a hand over hers. "You see," she said softly. "Your heart has always been your greatest treasure. And now the world knows it too." In that moment, the maid understood something she had always instinctively known, that life rewards those who give without expectation, that the smallest acts of care can ripple far beyond what one can imagine, and that true greatness lies not in wealth or fame, but in the quiet, consistent kindness one shows every single day. The days that followed the billionaire's visit were unlike any the maid had ever known. At first, she returned to her daily routine out of habit, preparing breakfasts, wiping counters, and walking to the elderly woman's house as she always had. Yet, something within her had shifted. The quiet certainty of her life now carried a sense of possibility she had never dared to imagine. Every step she took, every task she performed, was now colored by a mix of hope, gratitude, and wonder. Soon, the rewards promised by the billionaire began to unfold. The modest home she had lived in for years was improved with the necessities she had always lacked: a small garden where flowers could bloom, fresh furniture that made her daily life comfortable, and a room of her own filled with books and learning materials she had only dreamed of. But the most profound changes went far beyond material comforts. She was offered opportunities for education and training she could never have accessed on her own. The billionaire, impressed by her intelligence and dedication, arranged for her to attend courses that would help her develop skills for a better career. For the first time in her life, the maid felt that her potential was limitless. She could imagine a future where she could rise above her circumstances without compromising her values. The very thought exhilarated her. The elderly woman, who had watched her servant's life transform, could barely contain her joy. "You've always deserved more than this," she whispered one morning, tears welling in her eyes. "But you never asked for anything. You gave everything without expecting a reward, and now life is giving back in ways you could never have imagined." The maid simply smiled, overwhelmed by emotion. She realized that her acts of kindness had been their own reward all along, but the acknowledgement and support from someone so influential was a confirmation she had never anticipated. Beyond the immediate rewards, the maid also discovered something far more meaningful: the recognition of her worth. She had spent years thinking her small acts of care were ordinary, unnoticed, and perhaps insignificant. Now, she understood that every meal she had prepared, every flower she had watered, and every smile she had shared had created a ripple effect. The billionaire's attention had amplified it, but the true power had always resided in her dedication and compassion. With the new opportunities came responsibilities, too, and she embraced them wholeheartedly. She continued visiting the elderly woman every day, ensuring that the bonds of trust and care remained unbroken. But she also began helping others in the neighborhood, teaching children simple acts of kindness, supporting other women who struggled to make ends meet, and sharing the lessons she had learned about humility, generosity, and resilience. Her life was no longer just about survival; it had become a story of inspiration, impact, and leadership born from compassion. Word of her story slowly spread beyond the neighborhood. People were captivated by how someone so ordinary, so humble, could inspire change through quiet devotion. The maid became a symbol of hope, showing that even the smallest, daily acts of kindness could lead to extraordinary outcomes. She didn't seek fame or attention, but her story resonated deeply with anyone who believed in the power of human goodness. Yet, amid all the changes, the improved living conditions, the educational opportunities, and the growing recognition, the maid remained the same person she had always been. Her humility endured. She never let success or admiration alter her heart or purpose. In fact, she often reminded herself that the billionaire's support was only a reflection of the goodness she had practiced all along. The real reward, she realized, was the knowledge that she had lived a life of integrity, that her choices had made a tangible difference, and that her kindness had finally been recognized in a way that could transform her future. One evening, as the sun set and painted the sky in hues of gold and pink, the maid stood outside the elderly woman's home, looking at the garden she had helped nurture. Tears welled in her eyes, not from sadness, but from profound gratitude. She understood that life had a mysterious way of rewarding those who give without expectation, that good deeds can travel far beyond what one can see, and that sometimes, the world responds to genuine compassion in ways that are both beautiful and life-changing. In that moment, she realized her life had become a testament to a simple truth: true kindness, unwavering dedication, and a selfless heart are the seeds that grow into miracles. And now, finally, the world had begun to notice the extraordinary life she had quietly lived all along. After the whirlwind of events, the quiet mornings, the unnoticed acts of kindness, the surprise visit from the billionaire, and the life-changing rewards, the maid finally had a moment to pause and reflect. She had spent years living a humble life, giving her all without expectation, never seeking recognition, never imagining that her simple acts could ripple out to touch so many lives. And yet, here she was, standing in a home that was more comfortable than she had ever known, with opportunities unfolding before her, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had made a real difference in someone's life. The elderly woman, who had been her companion in this journey, smiled warmly at her. "Do you see now?" she asked softly. "You've lived a life of goodness every day. And the world has finally recognized it." The maid nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. It wasn't just the financial support or the recognition that moved her, it was the affirmation that her choices, her care, and her devotion had mattered. They had created ripples far beyond what she could see, touching lives in ways she had never imagined. In the days that followed, the maid began to understand the true power of her actions. She realized that the meals she had prepared, the surfaces she had wiped, the chairs she had adjusted, and the small notes she had left for the elderly woman were more than simple gestures, they were expressions of love, respect, and humanity. Each act had reinforced the value of compassion, showing that kindness is never small if it touches a heart, eases a burden, or brings comfort to someone who needs it most. The neighborhood continued to admire her, but now there was a deeper awareness. People no longer saw her simply as a maid who performed her duties, they saw a person who embodied integrity, humility, and selflessness. Children who had watched her grow curious now learned lessons in empathy, neighbors offered help and companionship, and even strangers were inspired by the story of her daily devotion. The maid's life had become a beacon of hope, demonstrating that the simplest acts, when performed with sincerity, can spark a chain of events that change not only one life but many. Yet, despite all the recognition and rewards, the maid remained grounded. She continued her daily visits to the elderly woman, continued her careful attention to the little details, and continued to spread kindness wherever she went. She understood that life's true reward is not measured in wealth or titles, but in the impact one leaves on others through consistent, selfless actions. Every morning she walked to the old woman's house with the same care she always had, yet now there was a quiet confidence in her step, a knowledge that her life mattered, and that her choices had a lasting effect. The billionaire's visit had opened doors and provided opportunities, but it had also reinforced a deeper truth, that integrity, compassion, and humility are qualities that cannot be bought, taught, or faked. They are cultivated through everyday choices, repeated over time with sincerity and dedication. And when those choices are made without expectation, the universe has a way of responding in ways that are extraordinary, often at the most unexpected moments. As she reflected on her journey, the maid felt a profound sense of gratitude, not only for the rewards she had received, but for the chance to live a life guided by kindness. She realized that every person has the power to impact the world around them, no matter how small their actions may seem. Even a simple breakfast, delivered with care every morning, can plant seeds of hope, inspire others, and create a story worth telling. Finally, she understood that her life had become a lesson not only for others but for herself, that true greatness is found in the quiet, consistent choices we make to do good, that kindness always returns in ways we cannot anticipate, and that the heart's capacity to give and love is the most powerful force in the world. Standing beside the elderly woman, looking at the small garden bathed in the morning light, the maid smiled. She had spent her life giving without expectation, and in return, she had received the most valuable gift of all, the knowledge that goodness matters, that kindness is never wasted, and that one person's devotion can indeed change the course of many lives. Her story, though simple, was extraordinary. And in its quiet power, it carried a timeless message. Life rewards those who act with love, humility, and selflessness, reminding us all that every small act of kindness has the potential to create miracles, even when no one is watching.